Hello, I'm Mujahid Ahmed. I'm a visiting faculty at OP Jindal Global University. The module is about effects and challenges of migration on the migrants and ways to protect their rights. The intended learning outcomes of the module are to help the students to get an insight on the issues and challenges migrants face in process of migration, to help students to get an understanding on the kinds of remedies available to address the problems faced by the migrants. Migration has both negative and positive consequences for the migrants and their families. There are varied opinions that migration is beneficial for migrants, but if the rights of such migrants are violated, then it's critical. In the process of migration, poor communities are the most affected groups who face crisis in getting basic amenities, decent standards of living, inability to access the entitlements they are eligible to, and hardly possess meager personal assets and suffer a range of deprivations wherever they are located. Forced migrants are also face similar problems, but their problems are more serious in nature. The major effects and challenges faced by the migrants. Documentation and identity of the migrants. In India, apart from Census of India and NSSO, there are no major records that are available regarding the migrants. It's easy to get data of the migrants who move to other countries, but internal migration data is not available, as neither states nor the central government maintains records of the movement of the people within the boundaries. Proving identity of migrants is one of the most essential needs when he or she arrives to another place, even though some may have recognized identity proof. Problems still persist when they migrate. In India, identity documentation is an authentication for the state government to provide benefits to the migrants, which is ensured to all citizens as applicable, since rights and protections is applicable to all people. Poor migrants, however, face several problems across the country in order to get identity proofs, etc., due to the lack of details the migrants have. Labor migrants are undocumented, even though there is a 1979 statute governing interstate migrant workers, but it is very limited, as discussed earlier, who face discrimination every now and then. The rules entitle migrants to access fresh ID proofs, etc. In practice, they find it difficult to get it. Many do not know the procedure to get them in order to avail the benefits and entitlements. For example, they cannot use the ration cards from their home states to avail PDS in the host state. Additionally, officials often discriminate migrants for various reasons which are prohibited under the law. Most importantly, poor and vulnerable migrants face challenges to obtain the benefits and entitlements wherever they are, because most of them are illiterate and lack an understanding of the local language. Hence, lack of identification means migrants will be deprived of the benefits and entitlements unless they are able to hire some services or need to seek assistance from middlemen who are corrupt. Poor and disadvantaged migrants require subsidized food, fuel, health services, or education that are meant for their survival. And these are basic requirements for them, since most of these migrants have moved out from their home states in order to earn and pay their debts and help their families who are under poverty. Well, let's look at the living conditions of the migrants. Majority of the migrant people live in deplorable conditions. Most of the poor migrants come to the urban areas where the cost of living is high and are forced to live in slums, etc., where they don't have access to safe residence, drinking water, sanitation, etc. These migrants have to live in open spaces or unsafe shelters, and these migrants have come to a new place where they do not have any contact to seek any assistance. As mentioned in the earlier point, food costs are higher, and the migrant people are not able to access or obtain temporary ration cards. In the case of migrant laborers, they live in deplorable conditions, even though there are a number of statutes in India which make it mandatory for the principal employers and contractors who employ these workers to provide all basic necessities as per law. The laws that are applicable include Interstate Migrant Workmen, Regulation of Employment and Conditions of Service Act 1979, Building and Other Construction Workers, Regulation of Employment and Conditions of Service Act 1996, Contract Labor, Regulation and Abolition Act 1970. Vulnerability of the migrants. So what are the vulnerabilities of migrants? Migrants are inherently vulnerable as subjects of human rights from the time they have their original place of residence. In most cases, how human beings are more vulnerable when they are displaced. Vulnerability is shaped by many factors, which includes political and social marginalization, lack of resources and support from the locality where they have shifted or detached from traditional support from their family. Also, the place where they're living is usually different with regard to culture, language, entitlements from the state, which they are not entitled to in the host state, which takes a long time for them to access such benefits after following due process. Many a times, host states fail to acknowledge their presence and do not consider them in policy making for welfare of its citizens. Most often, people of the host state have a feeling that the migrants are outsiders, which further add to their vulnerability. Most migrants face problems related to language as well, which is often different from what they speak. Being unable to speak to the local language, migrants becomes vulnerable and discriminated. This is a common in both internal and external migration scenario. Health aspects of the migrants. So what are the health aspects of the migrants? Migrant communities are employed in one of the other form, and majority of these migrants get into unorganized occupations and they face hard circumstances and live in pathetic conditions. They frequently face health problems and are vulnerable to disease both at the workplace and where they reside. The migrant workers, especially working in quarries, construction sites, etc., undergo serious health hazards and even face accidents and death in the work sites. The employers do not take care of these workers and fail to follow safety precautions under the law and are not entitled to access various health and family care programs due to their temporary statutes, and most of the workers do not get registered under the specific laws they are entitled. For example, construction workers must be registered under the Building and Other Construction Workers Regulation of Employment and Conditions of Services Act 1996, under which the Labor Department issues an identity card through which they become a beneficiary and can access a number of benefits, which include provide immediate assistance to a beneficiary in case of accident, pension to the beneficiaries who have completed 60 years, sanction loans and advances to the beneficiary for construction of a house, group insurance scheme for the beneficiaries, financial assistance for the education of children, medical expenses for the treatment of major ailments, payment of maternity benefit to the female beneficiaries, etc. Similarly, numbers of labor legislations which have been enacted for the workers, provide dozens of schemes and programs, but the migrant workers are hardly able to access them. There's limited access to entitlements. Migrations often lead to loss of basic entitlements that were enjoyed by the migrants in their home state. For example, in India, poor people are entitled to access subsidized food grains, fuel, scholarships, etc., either through central government or the state governments. And if the migrant moves to one state from another, he may not be eligible to the same entitlements he or she received in their home state, since the scenario is different and they need to take fresh approval in order to claim the benefit from the host state, because of most of the schemes are not transferable from one state to another, and schemes flow through the state or local government. Thus, the poor migrants face difficulties and the cost of living increases because they are not entitled to get subsidized goods and have to solely depend on general markets, and there are instances where migrants are cheated by the locals. Let's look at the migrant children and their conditions. Migrant children are the most affected members as they are most vulnerable, and poor migrants cannot access benefits that are required to be given to the children. Under the labor laws, employers have to establish or create facilities for the workers, including the migrants, since children often accompanying their families to the workplace are exposed to health hazards and accidents that can occur anytime. Migrant children are also deprived of getting free and compulsory education, and migrants' stay is temporary in nature, and most of these children get dropped out from schools. Migration is an important determinant for child labor in India, even though child labor is prohibited under the Child Labor Prohibition and Regulation Act, 1986. The ILO, in its roadmap for achieving the elimination of the worst forms of child labor, which was adopted at the Global Child Labor Conference in 2010, stated that governments should consider ways to address the potential vulnerability of children to, in particular, the worst forms of child labor in the context of migratory flows. Children migrate through their families independently through trafficking, or they may be left behind by their migrant parents. Migrants by the poor communities intended to happen as a survival strategy for their families, where vulnerable children were pushed into child labor. In the absence of access to quality education by the migrant families at migrated place, it is challenging for them to place their children in schools, even though the Right of Children to Free and Compulsory Education Act 2009 allows any child to get enrolled with any transfer certificates, etc. It's extremely difficult for the migrant families to do so. The Government of India, the Ministry of Labour and Employment, has issued a national protocol in March 2008 known as the Protocol on Prevention, Rescue, Repatriation and Rehabilitation of Trafficked and Migrant Child Labour. In wake of the above issues, which is alarming, and the Child Labour Act does not cover these issues. The protocol deals with the crucial issues relating to prevention, rescue, repatriation, and rehabilitation of trafficked and migrant child labor, which is not covered under the Child Labor Act. The protocol was notified due to the increasing trend in trafficking of migrant labor. The protocol issues guidelines to key stakeholders such as the Labor Department, Child Welfare Committee, Special Juvenile Police Unit, etc. on crucial issues relating to prevention, rescue, repatriation, and rehabilitation of trafficked and migrant child laborers. Let's now look at the social and demographic impacts of migration. Most people migrate from states which are socially and economically backward and migrate to new avenues where development is taking place on large scale, which attracts the migrants to come over. Since backward areas are not given due importance to development, even though there are schemes and programs which are not implemented effectively. Frequent drought, famine has failed the agricultural communities who have become indebted and need to seek alternative jobs in order to recover their lands and to settle the loans they have already taken, which have been a serious reason for migration in India over the years. Inter-district and interstate migration is taking place due to regional disparity in development influences, flow of migration streams. The migration pattern in India has proved that inequality in the regional development has led to migration all over. Progressive states which have developed well through higher investment, resources, and better job opportunities experience high influx of migration. At the same time, states which are underdeveloped and fail to help the marginalized and underprivileged groups have forced people to migrate. Hence, there is a need for a balanced regional development, and special focus needs to be given to the states which are performing badly, and development and investments, infrastructure, etc. be given to all states without any discrimination, which may help people not to leave their native state and help them to progress well in their respective places of origin, which in turn will lead to qualitative shift in the patterns of migration. The migration of people from rural areas to cities and towns has seen a steady increase from the provisional census of India report 2011. Increase in population in urban countries than in rural areas. The progress from 2001 to 11, the number of people living in urban areas has increased from 286 million to 377 million, a rise of 91 million. In comparison, the rural population increased by 90 million, up from 743 million in 2001 to 833 million. Now, the reasons include due to migration, personal factors like marriage, employment, etc. Now, let's look at surveillance on the migrants. Migrants legally do not violate any laws of the state if the due process is followed. Even though migrants have the right to migrate within the country without any restriction, frequently they are under scanner by state authorities, especially by the border forces, police, in the name of security reasons, which many a time lead to human rights violations. State authorities like police take their discretion and autonomy wrongly criminalize the migrants who are innocent. Such branding victimize the migrants who move to another place illegally. Sometimes they move without any identification documents, unknowingly because of illiteracy. Police and security forces give justification for keeping the migrants under surveillance. There are examples in India, especially where migrants have been falsely arrested for crimes which they have not committed. Migrants often have been questioned by authorities without reasons, making them feel threatened. This kind of approach to common within and outside the country, especially to keep a check on the migration movement during their period of stay. Human rights approach is very much essential for the migrants, which will ensure respect towards migrants as equals in the society rather legitimize migrants into violence, which is against the human rights, which is applicable to all. Let's look at the exploitation and deprivation. Migration flows involve chains of contractors and middlemen whose role is to source people and misguide them through false promises to migrate to other states, finally end up doing degrading jobs and amount to serious exploitation. Migrants who come from different occupations, willing to do unskilled jobs for very little wage, and they're extracted to work for long hours, and finally they're not even paid the minimum wages under the law. The contractors, principal employers, etc. take undue advantage of the migrants who are illiterate, who are pushed into such occupations due to poverty. Most of the migrants who are recruited for various national and international projects by the middlemen is done through exploitative recruitment practices for which the migrants have to pay huge sums of money as commissions, and the wages are fixed by these middlemen, which is hardly sufficient to meet even the basic requirements. It's also noted that poor migrants also face physical and sexual exploitation as well. The migrant workers are guaranteed certain forms of protection and rights under a broad canvas of labor laws, which include the right to minimum wages, overtime payments, weekly offs, specific allowances for the migrant workers, housing, etc. However, employers and contractors who are locally responsible for providing such protection to workers hardly implement them in the interest of the workers. In the case of the Interstate Migrant Workmen Act 1979, the employers and contractors do not register the migrant laborers, which result in exploitative practices against the migrant labor. The employers use various methods and provisions of the Act to evade from responsibility to protect the migrants and contend that Act does not apply, saying that the migrants have come on their own. Thus, a significant proportion of poor migrant workers are excluded from the purview of the Act. Migrants have less bargaining power in terms of wages, benefits, and working conditions, and hence experience all forms of exploitation. Migration also creates space for issues like racism and discrimination, since the migrants are non-locals who cannot speak the local language, find themselves not accepted by the communities where they are settled, and a wide range of discrimination is experienced by them. Trafficking is one such issue which is interlinked with migration, as discussed earlier. Human trafficking involves exploiting people through false hopes by agents who assure them a job and are pushed into trafficking for the purpose of prostitution, slave trade, etc., even though there are national and international conventions which protect migrants from such kind of exploitation. Today, trafficking of human beings has become an international business for traffickers, amounts to organized crime, which is a human rights violation. The magnitude of the problem is huge. However, the intervention is poor all over the world, including India, even though the rescue and rehabilitation of the victims are taken care of. The problem is increasing every day. The most affected population is women and children. Xenophobia approach. So let's look at the xenophobia question. Xenophobia comes from the Greek word xenos, meaning foreigner or stranger, and phobos, meaning fear. It can be defined as an attitude, prejudice, and behavior that rejects excludes persons based on the perception that they are outsiders or foreigners to the community, society, or national identity. Xenophobia often directed against migrants who become part of the society they settle in, which lead to elicit or facilitate hostile and violent reactions, wherein mass expulsion of immigrants takes place. The cultural elements make native people consider migrants as alien. Xenophobia tends to open interactions from anything outside themselves, resulting in isolationism that can further increase xenophobia on the migrants. Human rights violations against migrants include denial of access to fundamental economic and social rights, such as the right to education or the right to health, are often closely linked to discriminatory laws and practice, and to deep-seated xenophobic attitudes against migrants. These kind of approaches are against the fundamental principles laid down by the national and international legal framework. Now let's look at the measures to improve and protect the rights of migrants with reference to India. Protecting migrants' rights is the need of the hour. The protection of fundamental human rights and freedoms should not depend on where one is a native of the place or not, rather accepting them as individuals who need to be given equal respect and opportunity as per the norms of the state in general. However, it is the state's responsibility to uphold human rights through its laws and enforcement, whether he or she is an internal or external migrant. Migrants are vulnerable to human rights violations because they are considered outsiders rather than citizens, especially when it's an external in nature. Especially when it is internal in nature, similarly it is same in the context of migrants from abroad. The receiving states have larger responsibility in upholding and protecting the rights of the migrants. Migrants, especially women and children, are the most vulnerable groups who need special attention, who face human rights violations based on their migrant status as well as based on their sex. Whether migrants enter from one region to another or one country to another with authorization, or they are undocumented, they are generally find their rights discriminated in comparison with the citizens of their country or with the regional territory of residence. Human rights are inalienable and should be applicable to all, whether he or she is or not a citizen, are part of the notion of state sovereignty, even though the states have ultimate authority to protect and safeguard their borders, which are determined by their own laws. It's left to the states to determine the admission of non-nationals into their country, detention of such migrants, and removal of or expulsion of non-nationals from the state. Similarly, in interstate migration, in most cases there is freedom given to citizens to move anywhere within the territory of the state. For example, in India, it's allowed under the Constitution of India. Even though states have the power to manage migration flows, they also have the obligation to uphold the rights of individuals who migrate within their territory or coming from outside under their jurisdiction. Complying with international norms, India must comply with international human rights laws such as conventions, protocols, etc., which are in place for more than 2 decades. However, not many states have ratified such important international legal framework for protecting the rights of the migrants. There is always a fear that protecting human rights and placing the individual at the forefront of migration issues threatens state sovereignty. The internal legal framework may have some limitations, but taking the best of it will be of no harm. Some of them were discussed in the previous module, which were essential, but states have not taken them seriously. And the issues are increasing day by day. Data shows migration flow will increase in the coming years, and states cannot tackle them unless there is effective legal framework, for which international law will be a guiding force. The existing international law does not impose upon states to govern their migration flows or to formulate migration policies, but actually creates a sustainable basis for having long-term migration. Governance with respect for the migrants, whether they are internal or external in a human rights perspective. Effective national legal framework. In India, there is no major legislation that deals with the issues of migrants as well as those who are migrated to other countries for employment, etc. The existing law is the Interstate Migrant Workers Act, is restricted to migrant workers and does not cover all migrants, which we have seen in detail in previous module. The state lacks commitment and poor migrants are weak and vulnerable with little support from government. Since most of the migrant workers are employed in the unorganized sector, where the lack of regulations has compounded their vulnerability. The government must implement the Interstate Migrant Workers Act in full swing so that migrant worker rights are protected and violations can be reduced drastically. Similarly, government must also bring in a comprehensive legislation on migration using the international legal framework as mentioned in the previous point. Policy framework on migration. So let's look at the policy framework on migration. India has not come out with any national policy to focus more vigorously on migrant issues. Secondly, pro-poor development strategy in the backward areas must be the focus, since internal migration is increasing due to regional disparity and poor economic development. State must address the needs of such regions and simultaneously improve the access of the poor for better opportunities in terms of employment, financial assistance, etc. The state evolves development policy in order to maximize the positive impact in all regions, will encourage people to live in their homelands rather than face exploitation and discrimination outside. Therefore, the state must synergize migration and overall development to be strengthened hand in hand. In the recommendation, the National Commission on Rural Labor 1991 said migration policy has to be concerned not only with supporting migrants but also with the mutual links with migration and development. Interlinking of schemes and programs with flexibility to access such benefits. The state has to take up convergence strategy to solve the problem of migrants, especially the poor and the marginalized groups, by considering their poverty and illiteracy, which force them to migrate. Hence, if the state helps these migrants to access basic failures, education for children of the migrants, and better economic opportunities through the existing schemes and programs will help the migrants to attain a decent standard of living, which will ensure the human rights being protected. Migrants are particularly they have challenges to access the benefits in the host state due to various reasons. Hence, the state must help these migrants to access the schemes wherever they are living without any prejudice and discrimination. Now, what's the role of the civil society? Organizations and NGOs in supporting the labor migrants in India, there are several organizations which are actively engaged in helping to improve migrant workers, especially looking into the issues of minimum wages, working and living conditions, etc. They must also look into the issues concerning their entitlements, health issues, which migrants need support to access them. The legislation interventions have very limited approach, whereas diverse civil society organizations and NGOs are active, often step in wherever there is human rights violations. Therefore, the involvement of these groups will help to fill the gaps which are considered important, such as basic necessities, helping migrants to know their rights, creating awareness, etc., which the state cannot do. Now let's look at managing and directing migration flows. There's an urgent need for the state to manage and direct migration flows. The cases that came before the honorable courts, there were instances where the government was unable to give the exact figures how many migrant workers working in the projects undertaken by the government, like the Commonwealth Games, metro projects, etc. It's also important that labor markets of the major labor importing countries like Arab nations must be closely monitored with regarding to the immigrants moving into such countries for employment where rampant human rights violations become unnoticed. Hence, the government must have a check on the inflow and outflow of people migrating for various reasons in order to protect their rights. The Indian immigrants are vulnerable to exploitation and are ignorant of relevant laws and procedures. The increase in migration as well as the policy of localization by host countries further reduces the immigrational benefits to the worker. Therefore, the government, through a proactive policy to transform the immigration system and empower the immigrants through systematic interventions at the national, bilateral as well as the multilateral fronts, number of authorities and schemes have been introduced. This is to note, not many are able to access them since majority of them are illiterate or less informed. Please look at the following table to get an overview of the government measures taken to protect the rights of the immigrants. Now let's summarize. This module is very important for two reasons. One, it helps the learners to get an in-depth understanding of the problems migrants from within and outside face, especially in the context of human rights violations. Secondly, this module also captures relevant issues where there is a need to assistance and protection of the migrants need in order to protect their rights. In the beginning, we saw that migration has both negative and positive consequences for the migrants and their families, but abuses and deprivation of rights are also rampant not only in India, but all over the world. The module also brings new insights, especially the benefits and entitlements for the immigrants who go abroad for employment, which is very essential for protecting and safeguarding the rights of the immigrants. This is the end of the module. Thank you very much.